Convention actually claimed that people who wanted to get involved in politics were abandoning true Christianity. And it's hard for us today to appreciate how controversial that was, because it was the civil rights movement that mainstreamed that combination of religion and politics in the way that we think of it today. But it was controversial at the time. So King and the people who were with him and who asked him to lead them, it's not just he, there are lots of other people, they formed something called the Progressive National Baptist Convention. And that Progressive Convention said, it was reaching back to the traditions of the social gospel movement, and it said that true Christianity could not simply be concerned with saving a soul. It had to be concerned with changing society, and there was lots of theological traditions around. Again, people thought about this long before there was the United States of America. Okay, I'm not claiming this is a new idea. It became a movement that shaped the United States. And that idea that you had to bring these things together, and that the true gospel in the Christian tradition had to be a movement that actually transformed society, that was controversial. If you look at the Nation of Islam and the teachings about religion and politics going on in the controversies, they were fighting too. Similar kind of thing. If you look at Malcolm X's relationship to Elijah Muhammad, same fight. Muhammad was saying that this was a spiritual thing. Malcolm X was saying we've got to change laws and change society. Same kind of fight. You can see this happening in other things. So it's not a uniquely Christian story. It's a societal story. What is the relationship of religion and politics? The last vignette that I'll talk about, so I'm getting close to the end of my talk now. You should be excited. It's going to be your turn soon. So the last little vignette, we had the social gospel movement, the civil rights movement, and the last one I'll talk about is a Christian nationalist movement. And I'll look at one particular example of that is the moral majority. So the moral majority movement was in every sense inspired by the civil rights movement in order to negate it. And not just the civil rights movement, but a lot of things. The moral majority movement started in the 70s and grew very quickly to encompass millions of people. It was led by Jerry Falwell, who was a Baptist minister who articulated what many Christians were claiming at that time. And what they were claiming is that a lot of the changes that were happening in U.S. society, the anti-racist movement, the anti-war movement, the environmental movement, the feminist movement, there's like so many of these, the Chicano movement. This was the 50s and 60s were marked by an unusually high number of movements that were examining structural systems of oppression and marginalization. And they were all movements that were predicated on getting more people to participate in U.S. democracy. And that era was the first time you had a broad activation of multiracial democracy on that scale. The moral majority movement was especially concerned, so it's going on in the era of the Cold War. Soviet Union is seen as a great threat to the U.S. It's important to keep that in mind. Even though most of the communist movements happening in the world were actually being led by Christians. If you think of Jon Sobrino and Gustavo Gutierrez, these were liberation theologians in Latin America who were committed to creating socialist systems, and they had studied Marxist theory. They were most of the movements that were happening globally to expand socialism with a commitment to communism. Most of them are Christians, important to keep that in mind. In the United States, the story was that communism is an atheist movement, which in the Soviet Union it was. Right? But in the rest of the world, most of the people are actually Christians. But that didn't matter to the story in the United States. The story in the US was this is an atheist movement, and we have all these other movements happening in the world. So the moral majority comes in and says that we've got to save America from atheism, and we've got to save it from all of these other movements here. And because the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had predicated, its motto was to redeem the soul of America. That was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, to redeem the soul of America. I just told you, King didn't think that you could be a Christian by saving souls. It was a metaphorical soul that they were talking about. It was to redeem the society of America. The moral majority actually got inspired by this. They meant souls. They didn't mean, but although they also were operating on the idea of society, but what they said is what that fight was about that caused that split. What they said is true Christianity is about saving souls. It's not about changing all the society. However, if you look at what they did, what they modeled their movement on was the civil rights movement, was changing laws. Changing laws. And their message was that the majority of Americans, U.S. Americans, are moral, and by moral, they meant Christian in the way that their movement was. And that the laws of the U.S. needed to be based on biblical doctrine. That was that movement. And that it needed to save America from all of these movements that were going on that they read collectively as taking America away from its heritage and away from its God. So that idea of Christian nationalism, that your nation needed to be based on the teachings of Christianity, became eventually very influential, even though what had been influential earlier in the 20th century was, and more popular, was the social gospel tradition. That was actually, if you're looking for a popular thing, a popular movement that's having a lot of influence, that's getting a lot of attention, it's social gospel kind of thinking, until you get to the 50s and 60s, and there is a response to these things. So those are the three vignettes I'm going to tell you about. And so how do we make sense of those things? That's a little bit of some of the history of religion and politics. It's recent history, you know, there's lots of history before that, but I'm trying to get done in 5 minutes, so I'm going to bring it in. So those are three vignettes, right? How do we make sense of those things? Well, they all are demonstrating how religion is engaging with the politics of a society, in this case, in the context of a nation state, okay? They're also demonstrating how people, and I've used mostly the example of Christianity, but I've tried to remind you that other religions, particularly of Islam and Judaism, and not only those, are also participating in the same debates, because these debates are actually just societal debates. They may look like they're happening within the context of one religion. They're actually happening in the society. And so everybody is responding to them in some way. But I've tried to demonstrate, especially through Christianity, these examples, they're all pointing to their tradition, and they're acknowledging, and they're inspired. Whatever they're doing, their claiming is inspired by their tradition. They all claim to have beliefs that were religious beliefs. So when the social gospel movement said, we think that we have to end poverty and make sure that people are not in these city streets homeless and starving to death and dying, they claimed that that was because that their Christian faith and the Christian teachers inspired them, and not only inspired, but obligated them to actually do something about these problems. Same thing with the civil rights movement. Same thing with the moral majority. Okay? So I'm not to spoil the plot, but I'm not trying to claim that these are all basically the same. They're actually very, very different. But if you're looking for how they're different by trying to understand them as religious movements and to try to understand how one religion's movement might differ from another religious movement as a religious movement, or if we're trying to say, well, which of them, how are their doctrines different? What kind of traditions are they coming from? I don't think you'll ever reach a place where you can give an answer to the question that this forum has asked, and this: how do you bridge this gap? What should be the role of religion in politics if you are actually taking seriously the reality of a plural human society, of a diverse human society. That is a fact. That people are different. You may not like it, but that's the reality. It is. And if you take that seriously, then what's the role of religion? So I think the way to come at this is not to fixate so much on the religious part of the religion and to think more about the religion in the context of a society, okay? And so I'll give 3 quick examples. If you think about global contexts, the largest democracy in the world is India, whose population rivals or perhaps exceeds, depends on which day you count or estimate, that of China of 1.42579 billion, like almost 1.5 billion people. And China's about the same, about 1.5 billion people, okay? And like the US, has espoused ideals of inclusivity. It's very, very diverse. India is even more diverse than the United States. And it's a broad range of practices to try to be inclusive, and it's diversity in terms of many things, languages and religious traditions, etc. And yet is marked by deep, deep antipathy, has its own nationalist movement, a Hindu nationalist movement that especially targets Muslims by painting them as enemies of India, even though they're part of India. Israel is another example. It's a parliamentary state that has a president that's head of state, and it's actually parliament and prime minister that run the government. So the president is not the head of government in Israel. It's organized as a democracy, meaning that it's not a monarchy, okay? But it's also riven by deep divisions and inequalities, and those are structured. As recently as 2018, the Israeli government, for example, designated Israel as the right to self-determination as unique to the Jewish people, demoted Arabic so that it was no longer an official language, and focused on Jewish settlement in the occupied West Bank as actually one of the central aims of Israeli government. Israel is very diverse. It's a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. Like India, it has these deep divisions that are structural. And some of the people who live there are targeted as not belonging, even though they're people of that society. But both of those are democracies. Let's look at a monarchy, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy. And it is under the teachings of Islamic law, known as Sharia, and the Quran. It has no political parties, elections are not allowed. The monarch is absolute in his power, although in real life, one person can't run a country. you need lots of people working for you. But just in terms of its formal structure, it's a monarchy. Now, that doesn't mean that people aren't living well. Saudi Arabia, while we're debating universal basic income in the United States, we have academic talks about it. They actually have it in Saudi Arabia. They have a sovereign wealth fund. They're investing in all kinds of things, especially tech, to provide funding for infrastructure and education, etc. If you are a citizen of Saudi Arabia, you're not going to be homeless. You will not starve to death. Not going to happen. No. If you're not a citizen, it's really, really hard. You cannot become a citizen. It's really hard. Okay? So I said all of that, and I'm not trying to romanticize Saudi Arabia. There are deep inequalities, particularly given that millions of people live there and work there and they cannot be citizens, so they can't belong, and there is vicious forms of mistreatment of those who are immigrant laborers. And there are other things going on as well, patriarchal structures of authority in Saudi Arabia. I'm pointing to those things just to help us to think about, in context, what's going on in the United States. All of those, 3 of those examples, have very deep divisions and inequalities that intersect with religion. You can't boil it down and say it's all about religion. It is not all about religion. It's just lots of things going on. But it can be helpful to look around the world and try to think about what are some other things going on somewhere else in the world, and then come back to the U.S. and try to understand what we think is going on to answer this question: what should be the relationship? And so this is where I will end. Although it is true, there is no perfect society in the world. Every state, every sovereign state, so I don't mean the state of Virginia and the state of Oklahoma, I mean every sovereign state, what you might think of as a country or nation, has its own way of establishing authority and belonging, has its own way of establishing privileges and rights, even if they aren't called that. Even if they aren't called that. And the question of how people get to belong matters immensely. The United States has many, many, many problems that have been well documented and written about. And some people might want to say there are no problems, but that's fanciful thinking. They're deep problems. But that doesn't mean there aren't some really good things about the United States. There are, and they're worth fighting for. And that's what people are doing right now, trying to fight for these really good things. One of them is that you get to belong to the United States, at least at a formal level in terms of how it's structured, regardless of your religion or your nationality or your language, formally, that is formally. That's how it's structured. And even though in real life people are treated as if they don't have the right to belong, it makes all the difference in the world that at least formally they're supposed to be able to belong. Because that's what people are fighting to protect. When we look at voter restriction laws and their fights, that's what people are fighting to protect. Like you're supposed to have the right to vote, and that should not be impeded. And that actually makes it much easier for people to fight for that. Religion and politics, you get to belong regardless of your religion. So I think the way to come at this question, what should be the role of religion in politics, is actually by approaching it as a question of democracy. Of the different kinds of movements that we have talked about, or that one can read about, or that may be in the news media, because I've been talking mostly about the 20th century, come to the 21st. One of the ways you can distinguish between these things is by thinking about how they relate to the fundamental architecture of democracy. Now, we know the United States was created as a democracy that intentionally, deliberately, operationally excluded people through its practice. Okay? At the same time, however, because it was structured as popular sovereignty, it created the very basis for people to make arguments to be included. And I'm not trying to simplify democracy. It's very and I'm not trying to say this wonderful, perfect thing. It's what people do with it, okay? I am saying that if you take that and then you try to evaluate these religious movements and ask yourself, what should be the role of religion? And if you add to that, in a democratic state, then I think it becomes much easier to answer that question. Because one thing that religion should not do in a democratic state is to try to structure that state as a state where some people have a right to belong, have special rights to have rights that other people don't have. Or that some people have more of a pristine relationship to that state. Well, this is a Christian nation, and I'm a Christian, and so you other people who are not Christians don't really belong in the way that I belong. That should not happen in a democratic state. And so you can ask the question, how are people leveraging, activating, their religion? Are they doing that in a way that actually takes us closer to the goal of having more people be able to participate, be recognized as belonging, and to have their right to be recognized as rights-bearing people? Is it promoting that? Is it trying to take away rights? What's very clear from the social gospel movement and the civil rights movement is that the effect of the social gospel movement was to help people to experience belonging in a day-to-day sense. They weren't trying to change laws, remember that. They were trying to change the conditions of life so that people were not suffering from poverty and starving to death and unable to access education and housing, etc. And by addressing those things, you actually get more democratic participation in your society. Civil rights movement, same thing. It was trying to create multiracial democracy. It was trying to address structural inequality. The Mormon majority, if you ask this question in a democratic state, was defining non-Christians as actually the enemy. One of the problems that we're claiming is that people are not Christian enough. Too many people are left, or not enough people are on board. The civil rights movement was not trying to say that people who are not Christians are the problem. In fact, people who weren't Christians were part of it. And so if you are thinking about the question of democracy, I think it helps to answer that question. And that is one thing I want to suggest as a way to bridge this gap. It matters immensely whether democratic systems and structures are actually able to function as such. And we could easily lose those formalities. We can. We can recognize how they have all kinds of problems, but we do have these formal structures, and they can be undone. And I think that has to be one of the high priorities when we're trying to answer this question. So I'll stop there. I want to thank you again for this invitation to talk about religion and politics. I hope you found helpful some of that. I'd love to hear your ideas and your questions and your agreements or disagreements. I look forward to the conversation, and thank you again.
Or if you prefer, I can bring the microphone to you. You can ask your question. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
I can read them and answer.
Either way.
Yeah. So one is, what impact did the social gospel movement have on the assimilation of the Great Migration into urban communities of the North and West? This is a great question. Right? Because the Great Migration was involving hundreds of thousands of people moving very quickly. And this Great Migration, particularly, specifically examining the movement of African Americans from the South to the North and West, and something like 350,000 people in about a 15-year period, or 12 to 15-year period, and then continuing even beyond that. Assimilation, of course, meaning what ways were people being compelled to change their cultural ways of moving and being in the world. The movement had a huge impact on trying to change the culture of people, and that was everything from how they dressed to their speech, to their music. Those of you who, you probably know this already, a lot of the great musical genres that are celebrated today, blues is one of those, was looked down on and was treated as something that was a bunch of noise that people should stop making. And eventually people recognized it as a very important musical genre. But it was an example of something that got vilified because it was showing up. It was from the South, and it was showing up in these northern venues. And so it was an example of an effort to try to get people to change their culture to fit into the North or to fit into the West. The religious forms of religious activity, same kind of thing. Where the more high church style of worship was more common in the North. Wasn't the only thing that was there, it's diverse. High church was not as popular in southern regions, and so there were conflicts over that. And many people coming from the South were told they needed to have more dignified religious meetings. And so this is a great question because it shows how a movement of social gospel that aimed to provide very important resources that people needed also carried with it ways of demeaning or deriding or vilifying people's cultures and their identities. And so that's a great question. Another question, in your opinion, are there distinct differences between Christian nationalism and white nationalism? And if so, what are they in the context of the U.S.? This is a great question. There are certainly differences. So one of the important ones is that Christian nationalism is a multiracial movement. Now, the majority of the organizations and the lead actors of Christian nationalism are white American Christians. But Christian nationalism is not simply a white Christian phenomenon. It is a multiracial phenomenon. And it would be, I think you would have more democratic outcomes if it were true that the only people who are participating in Christian nationalism, and I've tried to explain what I mean by Christian nationalism, means it's the fight or activism to make the nation one that is predicated formally on Christianity and belonging on Christianity, which means people who aren't Christians are the enemy. They're the problem, and they either have to be, something has to be done with them. Okay? That it would be better if only one group of people were participating in Christian nationalism, because that's having lots of destructive effects. But it's not true. It's a multiracial movement, and so that's one of the most important things to observe, even though most of the actors in Christian nationalism are white. Next. Next question. Certain politicians seem to appeal to voters by claiming persecution. What are effective ways to clarify to voters that pointing out failures of logical reasoning, illogical arguments, or criminal actions such as violating campaign finance laws is reasonable and important? Some voters are apparently aligning with the persecution framing and telling neighbors it is mean to point out criminal acts on the part of politicians. So it's a very good question, because one of the most important heritages of Christianity, of course, is persecution. If you know anything, and you do, about the origins of Christianity, you know it started off as an illegal sect. And it was against the law in the Roman Empire at one point to belong to Christianity. Constantine changed that in the 300s, the 4th century, but before there was illegal, and so there are lots of narratives of martyrdom, and it's just very much a part of the tradition. But of course, Christianity eventually became, religion of the empire, became very powerful. In the United States, Christians have always been the majority let me have to say that right, because the U.S. as a state at first encompassed mostly indigenous people who were subject to it and under it, and they actually at first were the majority. So I have to nuance that. But eventually, most of the people who are under the rule of the state, of the United States, most of them are classified as Christians eventually at some point. And in terms of the ability to exercise power in that state, to benefit from a privileged status, sociologically, privilege and status accrued to Christians. It is not true that Christians, as Christians, have been persecuted in the United States. However, it is certainly common, as this person who wrote this question, it's common to hear Christian nationalists open with this claim that they have been targeted as Christians with persecution because they are Christians, and by persecution meaning they're not allowed to practice their beliefs. They're not allowed to exercise their religion. So that strictly speaks, so this person's asking, how do you counter that? Do you try to use a logical argument? Do you try to do something else? And you're pointing also to the lots of illegal acts by politicians who are in the media. You quickly Google and find who they are. I don't need to say who they are. And find examples of this. So I think one way, the stories that we tell are important. I think that the role of education cannot be underestimated. And I don't just mean formal education, I mean mass media education, where people come to find out things. I think it's important to recognize a lot of the targeting against what is often called critical race theory but is used to refer to any study of structural systemic inequality. The targeting of that is actually a response in part to the effectiveness of allowing people to learn about the histories of quote-unquote others, learning about people who are not Christians, learning about people who are queer or trans, learning about people who are Black, Indigenous, or other people of color, learning about these political histories. And as you learn about that and as you come to understand systems of power, that's one of the most important ways for people who actually hold the majority of power in the society to have a more accurate understanding of it. And so the education needs to continue. We need to preserve the right for people to learn about these difficult histories, but that's not enough. I think the power of mass media is very important. There are very powerful media companies that give a lot of airtime to a false claim of persecution. It is very dangerous in any society when the people who hold a majority of power think that they are being persecuted and that they're in danger from minorities. That's very dangerous because it has repeatedly historically led to ethnic cleansing against minorities, or even more extreme forms of that, the term is genocide against those minorities. So that's a very dangerous situation, and so that adds to the urgency of having a good response to the issue that this person is asking about. I feel like I'm talking too much. I'd love to hear comments as well as questions.
Are there any other questions? I'll bring the mic to you.
Can you hear me through the mask? Okay. I have a question around myth and story. And so I'm thinking of this as a literature professor. Moving us a little farther back, you've talked about the social gospel of the 20th century. I'm wondering if you've engaged this question around some of the early colonists. I'm particularly thinking of the lawyer John Winthrop and his City on a Hill, that famous sermon from A Model of Christian Charity, where Winthrop, not a minister, but a lawyer, right, posits this vision of, for we shall be like a city on a hill and a beacon and a light for others to follow. And I'm thinking about the ways in which that sermon has been applied in political discourse. I would often trace it to other political actors, like the first George Bush and his 1,000 Points of Light, or even John F. Kennedy with his particular political vision, as well as in political leaders. So I guess as I heard your talk today, I'm just curious if you've engaged with this question about the mythology of this idea of America as a beacon and how that is being applied both in the past and how that mythology has made its way into our present moment about how we engage with questions about the role that Christianity has and how we move forward as a nation in that political vision.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for that. I think it helps to elevate the importance of global context. You're talking about America as an exemplum, not just any exemplum, but the exemplum for the world. So I would say a couple of things. And one, it is important to ensure that we're bringing to the surface and that we are communicating again at a mass level the complex role not only of the United States. The United States does a lot of things. We do a lot of good in the world, and we do a lot of harm in the world. We have provided assistance to lots of regions, nations in desperate times, partly because we have military bases all over the world, and we can easily move things around quickly. And we've also overthrown democracies and killed democratically elected leaders and have supported very brutal governments. And so I think that that complexity has to be communicated. That's the first thing. And I think the second thing is at the complexity of other nations, particularly those nations who are reduced in our popular media, even in so-called progressive media, that are reduced to being rogue or authoritarian is a word that's used, or somehow brutal dictatorial regime, that we actually try to understand in a more full fashion how those societies operate and what they are. This is why when I was talking about Saudi Arabia, I try to explain that it's not only a monarchy that does not allow elections and that actually enforces a very brutal way of governing over people who are not citizens, but it also provides universal basic income. They don't let their citizens starve. You're not going to be homeless as a citizen. If you live in the United States, you can die right out here on the street. And so a lot of our politics our political discourse and policies are driven by anti-China now. And that's probably the one thing that unites people across the aisles of Congress. I think maybe there's something else, but I know that is. And you know, it becomes it begins to function as dehumanizing people. And we saw this in the Cold War, where you just dehumanize people. And then when you go and overthrow their democracies, which is what we did around the world, we did it in the name of fighting communism. That's how we did it. And it got lots of support. And we murdered a lot of people. I was just in Chile a few months ago. We helped overthrow their democratically elected president in the 1970s, Allende. And we helped to disappear a lot of people. We did it in Iran in the 1950s. We overthrew their democracy, and the CIA went in and we trained Iran's government to torture. And we armed them and we helped them to disappear and torture a lot of people. But you probably don't hear about that in the media. So I think it's important that we do that, because I don't think it's wrong to say that there can be a good example of how to do something. But I think if I'm understanding your question about mythologizing things, we get away from the truth, and myth has many kinds of meaning, but we get away from the truth, the mythological in that sense, when we become reductive and we tell these simplistic stories about ourselves and about other nations. I think we need to be a lot more truthful and more inclusive in understanding geopolitical realities, so that we do try to do some good in the world, and we also recognize very clearly that it makes no sense to try to divide the world into these are the good nations over here, and this is the axis of evil, and here are the evil rogue nations. We can wipe them off the face of the earth because we're not even going to humanize them.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Sir. Sure.
Thank you very much. It's very thought-provoking. If I understand what your basic argument is that a litmus test of how helpful religious activity is in a democratic nation is to the extent that it allows more people in that society to participate in that democracy. To that extent, it's helpful. To the extent that it doesn't do that, it's unhelpful. My first question is, did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So if I got that right,
Yes.
I am now trying to think through, the corollary of that argument was don't try to parse between the religious traditions and their doctrines to find out which ones are more helpful or not helpful. And yet, I'm finding it hard to separate completely the doctrinal commitments of a religious community from its effect on democracy. The example, I have a curious background in the sense that my father was Hindu, my mother was a nominal Christian. I came here, I became, as a student, became an evangelical Christian. I've been ashamed to be an evangelical Christian in America lately, rethinking a lot of things. But as I think about the commitments of evangelicalism, the idea is that you have good news to share. Mm-hmm. You have an obligation to make an impact. And that seems, I guess it depends on what you do with that. But it does not seem very clear to me that one can ignore the doctrinal positions and how they play out in answering this question.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. That's very richly rendered, so thank you for that comment, that question. You're exactly right. So his question was, I can't as eloquently as he did, but the question, one point of that question is that he's saying it doesn't seem plausible that one can simply ignore the doctrines of a religious movement or religious activism and simply focus on whether that movement is enabling more democratic participation or negating democratic participation, because that was as he framed it, litmus test. That's where I'm going with an answer to this question. So that was beautifully rendered and very, very carefully articulated, so thank you for that. So yeah, I'd certainly agree. I didn't mean to intend that one should completely ignore doctrines. I guess, and I think to your point, it depends on what are people doing with it. And if we take it as an example, the idea that let's just take something like that there is a creator God who created all people. Let's just take something like that. Okay. And let's just say, well, that's a religious belief. Okay, so what do you do with that? Because I could take that and say, all right, so we need to pass a law and ban all this scientific teaching in these schools where they're claiming that the earth is billions of years old and that it wasn't made in 6 days, because my religious belief teaches me that God created all people and all things, and they're claiming over there in those science departments and those science textbooks that something else happened, right? So that's one way, right? Another way is, same thing, I believe that God created all people and all things. And some people have said this, so everyone has to be treated equally. We're all children of God, that we should not use any of the we shouldn't create any social distinctions in order to try to marginalize people. We should uplift and behold the inherent dignity of all people, because everyone is reflecting the image of God. Okay, so you can share a doctrine at a formal level, and then what you do with that can actually end up looking very different, which is sort of what you were getting at, right? When you talked about evangelicalism. I think one of the challenges that your question helps to elucidate is that there's a lot of shorthand in our everyday media-driven conversation. I'm not trying to vilify media. We need media. You have very large companies that use language, and the rest of us start to adopt it. The social gospel movement, if you took away evangelicals from the social gospel movement, you wouldn't have one. I mean, you wouldn't. But they weren't, this is your point, right? They weren't using evangelicalism to say, we have to turn everybody into Christians, and the problem with our society is that some people aren't Christians, and we got to get rid of them, either convert them or move them out or do something else. One way of formulating this is the problem of, is it the problem of the non-Christian or the problem of the non-person? Right? Is the problem that not enough people are Christian, and we need to turn them, and then you have to figure out which kind of Christian you want them to be, because there are many, right? Or is the problem that people are dehumanized, and what they need to be able to do is flourish in society? So your question is beautifully rendered, and I agree with you. We cannot ignore doctrine. There are many Christianities out there. There are many types of evangelical Christianity, and I think it's an imprecision in our public conversation about these things I tried not to use the term evangelicalism. I try to talk about Christian nationalism because I think it's more precise at getting at what I understand to be a problem. Because evangelicalism is actually far more complex and heterogeneous than is reflected in the way we typically talk about it in the media.
I think all of you all will agree that we could continue this conversation for a few more hours, but we're going to take one more question. Dr. Reed had a question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Reverend Phillips to close us out.
That was a big question. This is a little question. But it's related, I think, to the topic of tonight. And I want you to respond to this. There has traditionally been this kind of criticism of religion messing in politics because it may be bad, but that is overwhelmed by the number of people who said, oh, that would be good if we could get Christians more involved in it because they have a better message, okay, and a good message. But more recently, it seemed to me that the argument could be made the other way. I keep hearing these comments that politics is changing Christians. In other words, it's causing many people to not believe in what we know about or think about the works of Jesus. In fact, I've read several instances of people being asked, oh, where did you get that from? And he said, well, maybe the Sermon on the Mount or somewhere. And people not believing that Jesus has spoken that because that's awfully weak.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm trying to remember the name of the person who made that claim. They were saying that if Jesus were really someone who was preaching empathy and compassion, that. Yes. So I think if I'm understanding you correctly, is it that we're seeing, is part of your point, that politics has actually transformed religion to some degree? I think that's certainly true. I don't think it will be possible for politics not to have an influence on X, right? And then that would include religion. I'm not sure that the fundamental problem is politics. I think politics is inherent to a society. In other words, could you have a society that had no political aspect to it? My concern more is how is it structured? And I go back to the point that there are many different Christians. So here's one thing your question made me consider more, and it is that so I told you, early 20th century, if you were looking for the most influential, visible, legible, in the news form of Christianity, it would have been social gospel Christianity in the early 20th century. Like, that's what was in the headlines. That's what got people were flocking to. The first mega church in the United States ever was Olivet Baptist Church. It was an African-American congregation in the city of Chicago. And they went from 300 or 400 people to something like 7,000 or 8,000 people. It was the first megachurch. You know why they were so big? Social gospel. People needed to eat. People needed housing. People needed education. And there was an African-American social worker a black woman who started working at that church, and she started interviewing people who lived in Bronzeville, this one neighborhood in Chicago. And what she realized is that people needed food and housing and education and shelter, et cetera. And so she worked with the pastor of that church to structure their programming, their activities to meet those needs. And they had 8,000 people. Today's megachurch will often have a soup kitchen and, run a school. But if you listen to the gospel that they're preaching, it is so different from that, right? And so my point is that I think we have to consider that the way our media and our society, I'm not trying to vilify media, our society represents being a true Christian today, being someone who's serious about the faith. When we say those things, when you read those words, the people they're usually talking about are people who are advocating to take away rights from some other people. And all the other Christians who also believe deeply in their faith and who are really serious about their religion and who are out there trying to advance human rights, they're talked about and described as not serious about their religion, as not deeply rooted in their faith. That's the pattern. And I think it's part of the answer to this, that I think we have to, as a society, stop representing true believers as only people who are promoting bigotry. And I think we need to recognize we should be calling Christians, Jews, Muslims, who actually want more people to have more rights, who are trying to expand civil liberties and human rights. We need to call them true believers, or at least be equitable, to call everybody a true believer. But what we do is exclude them, and we make it seem as if they just go along with anything because they're not really serious about their faith. When in fact, it's because they're serious about their faith that they're out there advancing those things. So, there.
So I just wanted to say amen. Not only did you give us a much more nuanced and complex answer to the question than I could have imagined, and I'm going to be chewing on this for a few days, but you gave us kind of a call to action at the end there that I really am taking to heart. And so thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and entertaining questions. And I need to talk to you before I write my sermon for this Sunday. And also, here's a token of our appreciation. So let's thank him again. And I think we want to say that the Religious Affairs Committee of the NAACP is looking for new members always. And I think our next public meeting will be on the 28th of November at Asbury Methodist over in Christiansburg. So you are more than welcome to join us. Thank you so much for coming out.